The CFO mocked my monthly expense spreadsheet with "We're not buying rocket parts, keep it simple," so I changed the tabs to names like Fuel Module and Launch Forecast, then added a chart called Trajectory to Q4. When he presented it at the stakeholder meeting, no one noticed until I work as a financial analyst for a mid-sized manufacturing company in Dayton, Ohio. We're not a startup, but we're not a dinosaur either. Just one of those companies that's been around long enough to have layers of management who like to feel important while doing very little that's actually productive. My job is pretty straightforward. Every month, I compile all departmental expenses into a clean, color-coded spreadsheet for the CFO, Doug. This thing is my baby. I format it so anyone can follow the numbers, even if they're new to finance. I double-check totals, highlight anomalies, and include brief, plain English notes for anything that stands out. Doug is, well, he's the type who likes to perform in front of the higher-ups. He'll take my spreadsheet, skim it for 5 minutes, and then present it as if he personally pulled all the data. I've never minded that part, it's corporate life, but Doug has a bad habit of making digs at people to make himself look smart. Last month, I emailed him the usual spreadsheet, and within 10 minutes he replied all, with the COO, CEO, and a couple of department heads copied in, saying, "Thanks, but we're not buying rocket parts here. Keep it simple next time." He followed it up with a little laughing emoji. In front of everyone. I just stared at the screen. My spreadsheet was already simple. I'd even stripped out a few breakdowns because Doug said last quarter it was too detailed. I'd never been publicly mocked in a work email before, and the fact that he did it to flex in front of the C-suite stung more than I expected. So I decided I'd keep it simple, in my own way. The next month, when I was preparing the spreadsheet, I made some adjustments. I kept all the actual data exactly the same. All the formulas were untouched. But instead of the normal tab names like Marketing, Operations, and HR, I renamed them to things like Fuel Module, Marketing, Payload Bay, Operations, Control Center, HR, Thermal Shielding, Facilities, Mission Debrief, Summary Page. On the cover sheet, instead of Monthly Expense Overview, I titled it Mission Spending Report, Orbital Phase 3. I swapped the normal Q4 forecast chart with one called Trajectory to Q4, complete with a little rocket clip art in the corner. The expense total line was labeled Mission Fuel Consumption. It was subtle enough that if you were moving fast, you'd just think it was some quirky formatting choice. But if you stopped to read, it was obvious the whole thing was dressed up like a NASA launch budget. I emailed it to Doug the day before the stakeholder meeting with a simple note. Kept it simple, as requested. The next day, I sat in the conference room with my laptop, pretending to work while keeping one ear on the meeting audio. Doug was in full look how competent I am mode, clicking through my spreadsheet on the projector. "Here's our trajectory to Q4, he said, pointing to the rocket-themed chart. "We've got good momentum in the fuel module and thermal shielding." I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. The man didn't even blink. He was just reading the names as if they were completely normal. For 20 whole minutes, this guy confidently walked the CEO, COO, and department heads through a NASA-themed budget breakdown like it was the most serious thing in the world. And then it happened. About halfway through, our VP of Sales, Greg, raised his hand and asked, "Why is marketing called Fuel Module? And what the hell is Payload Bay?" The room got quiet. Doug looked at the screen, then back at Greg, then back at the screen again. You could see the moment it hit him. The slow, dawning horror as he realized he'd been narrating a space launch plan to the company's leadership without noticing. The CEO tilted his head and said, "Doug, is this some kind of metaphor?" Doug stammered something about trying a creative approach to data visualization and keeping things engaging, but I could tell no one was buying it. A couple of people in the back started chuckling. Greg outright laughed. Doug wrapped up fast after that, skipping through the rest of the tabs without naming them. When the meeting ended, I avoided eye contact and quietly packed up my laptop. I was halfway back to my desk when Doug appeared in my doorway. He shut the door behind him. "Did you rename the tabs?" he asked flatly. I kept my face neutral. I kept it simple. He stared at me for a long moment, then said, "Don't do it again," and walked out. I didn't hear anything else about it that day, but word started spreading around the office. People from other departments would pass my desk, smirking. One of the IT guys stopped me in the break room just to say, "Fuel module, huh? Legendary." The joke was supposed to die after a couple days. I figured people would get their laughs, Doug would sulk for a bit, and we'd all move on. But it didn't. By the next week, the fuel module thing had taken on a life of its own. The facilities team labeled the coffee budget rocket fuel in their own expense report. The receptionist changed the Wi-Fi network name to Control Center. Even the CEO joked during a Friday meeting, "Let's make sure our trajectory to Q4 stays on course." Doug didn't find it funny. I started noticing little changes in how he interacted with me. Before, he would just take my spreadsheet without a word. Now he'd nitpick tiny things in my work, decimal formatting, font size, column widths. He'd forget to invite me to meetings where my presence was normally expected. He even started forwarding my email attachments to someone else in finance for review. It was petty, but I let it slide. Until the end of the month. That's when he called me into his office and shut the door again. He had my latest spreadsheet open on his monitor, a perfectly normal one, no jokes, no NASA theme, but he was scrolling through it like he was looking for something wrong. "You double-checked the totals?" he asked. "Yes." "You sure?" "Yes." 3 times. He leaned back. "Because the COO just sent me an email about a $9,800 discrepancy in operations. And since you're the one compiling this, that's your mistake." My stomach dropped. A discrepancy that big could make me look seriously incompetent. I asked to see the COO's email. Doug hesitated, then turned the screen toward me. The numbers in question were off, but they weren't from my file. The formatting was totally different. "This wasn't my spreadsheet." "This isn't mine," I said. Doug smiled just a little. "Well, you're the only one who does these reports." Something clicked in my head. He was setting me up. I went back to my desk and dug through my sent emails. My original file was fine, numbers balanced perfectly. I printed a copy and marched straight to the COO's office. Turns out Doug had taken my report, simplified it by cutting out some line items, and accidentally deleted a formula that caused the totals to break. The COO didn't look happy when I explained. "So this wasn't your work?" "No, sir. That's my original," I said, sliding my printout across his desk. He nodded slowly, thanked me, and said he'd look into it. By the next day, the mood in the office shifted. Doug wasn't strutting around anymore. He kept his door closed most of the morning. At lunch, Greg from sales found me in the break room and said, "You know he's pissed you went over his head, right?" I shrugged. Better than letting him pin it on me. Greg leaned closer. "Careful. Guys like him don't let stuff go. He's gonna come for you." I believed him. Doug had already shown me he could be petty, but now he had a reason to go nuclear. That afternoon, I got an email from HR. "Hi, please come by our office tomorrow at 9 a.m. to discuss recent workplace conduct concerns." No details. No explanation. Just a sinking feeling that my little fuel module joke had officially turned into a full-on war. The HR meeting the next morning felt like walking into a courtroom where I didn't know the charges. Janice from HR was sitting at the head of the table, a notepad in front of her, pen in hand. Beside her was another HR rep I didn't recognize, which immediately set off alarms in my head. HR never brings a second person unless they want a witness. "Thanks for coming in," Janice said in her calm, fake nice voice. "We've had some concerns brought to our attention about your conduct in the workplace." "Concerns?" I asked. "About what exactly?" She glanced at her notes. "2 things. First, you allegedly sent an inappropriate company-wide email last month that was mocking in nature. And second, there have been complaints about you creating a hostile environment for your supervisor." I blinked. "You mean the spreadsheet?" Her pen tapped against the paper. "The rocket launch-themed one, yes." I sat back in my chair. "That wasn't a company-wide email. I sent it to Doug, as I always do." "And hostile?" "Because of a spreadsheet joke." Janice leaned forward. "Doug reported that you intentionally undermined his credibility during a high-level meeting." There it was, his angle. He was trying to frame my harmless joke as sabotage. I kept my voice even. "I didn't speak in that meeting. I wasn't even in the room." "That's not the point," she said. "It's about intent. Did you intend for him to look foolish?" I wanted to laugh, but I knew better. "No. I intended to keep my job while still meeting the request to keep it simple." She gave me a tight smile that told me she wasn't buying it, or wasn't allowed to admit she was. "This is just a preliminary conversation," she said. "But I'd advise you to be mindful moving forward. We'll be following up." When I walked out, Doug was at his desk typing. He didn't look at me, but I could see the smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. That's when I realized 2 things. He wasn't going to stop. I couldn't win by just playing defense. The next week, I kept my head down. I did my work, avoided giving him anything to use against me. But I also started paying attention. I noticed Doug left his office door open when he took calls. I noticed he'd sometimes pull numbers from last quarter and pass them off as projections, to make our performance look better in reports. I noticed the way he'd brag about streamlining processes that other people had actually done. And then came the slip-up. One Thursday afternoon, he was on the phone with someone from the Chicago office, pacing in the hallway. I heard him say, "No, don't put that in writing. Just roll it into the discretionary fund and mark it as vendor services. Trust me, they won't ask." My stomach tightened. That didn't sound like streamlining. That sounded like hiding expenses. So I started digging. I went back through 6 months of his revised versions of my spreadsheets. And sure enough, there were inconsistencies. Small amounts moved from one category to another, totals that didn't match original receipts, and vague vendor services charges with no backup documentation. By the end of the weekend, I had a folder with everything neatly organized, his original emails, the doctored spreadsheets, the receipts. If he wanted to play games, I was about to change the rules. I didn't move right away. The evidence I had on Doug was good, damning, even, but using it too soon would just make me look like I was retaliating. HR already had me on their radar thanks to his little stunt. If I went to them directly, he'd spin it into a disgruntled employee lashing out. So I decided to be patient. If Doug wanted a war, I'd let him think he was winning for a while. The following Monday, he started his next round of corrections to my work. This time he sent me a spreadsheet back with half the notes deleted and a passive-aggressive comment in red font. Next time, try to keep the creative flourishes to a minimum. No jokes this time. He just wanted me to feel the leash tightening. But I was already playing a different game. I started copying certain people on my email chains. Not everyone, just the right people. The CFO, the internal auditor. Even Greg from sales when the numbers touched his department. I worded things carefully. Per Doug's request, please find the original data attached for reference before any revisions are made. It was subtle, but it planted a seed. There's a difference between my data and Doug's revisions. Meanwhile, I kept collecting. Every altered total. Every vague vendor services entry. Every time he told me to strip out a line item before a meeting. I even saved audio snippets. Not recordings I made on purpose, just ones that were part of Teams calls where he forgot to mute and spoke about massaging numbers. By mid-February, I had enough to make an auditor salivate. Then something interesting happened. One morning, Greg stopped by my desk and dropped his voice. "Hey, not sure if this is anything, but Doug's been asking questions about who you hang out with at lunch." I raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Greg shrugged. "I think he's trying to figure out if you're talking to the wrong people. Or the right people, depending on how you look at it." That told me 2 things. He was nervous. He suspected I had something. I decided to give him just enough rope. The next expense cycle, I left a small mistake in the draft spreadsheet I sent him, a miscalculated total in one of the vendor lines. I knew he'd fix it his way before presenting it. Sure enough, by the time the file came back to me, the number was magically corrected. But not in the right way. He'd inflated it, moved the excess into discretionary, and hid the original line item. That one file, compared side by side with my original, was clean, undeniable proof of manipulation. 2 weeks later, the annual internal audit notice went out to the whole company. Doug probably saw it as routine. I saw it as the moment the countdown started. The audit was scheduled for the first week of April. Most people treat it like a minor inconvenience, a few emails, some receipts, maybe a meeting or 2. But for someone like Doug, who'd been quietly adjusting numbers for months, it was a minefield. I didn't tell anyone what I had. Not even Greg. Instead, I started making myself useful to the auditors before they even arrived. Whenever I emailed Doug a monthly spreadsheet, I attached 2 files. Original data, compiled by finance, mine revision, per Doug's updates, his changes. I copied the internal audit manager on every single one. I never accused him of anything. I just framed it like, here's my work, and here's the CFO's finalized version, in case anyone needs context. I knew those emails would be gold once the auditors started pulling random samples. About a week before the audit, Doug's tone toward me shifted. He wasn't snide anymore. He was oddly polite, asking how my weekend was, thanking me for turning things in early. It wasn't kindness. It was suspicion. On Thursday afternoon, he popped his head into my cubicle. "Hey," he said casually, "audit's coming up next week. Just a heads up, they'll probably pull the last few months of expense reports. If they email you, forward it to me first so I can make sure they have the right versions." I looked him right in the eye. Of course. Then I smiled because I already knew the right versions were sitting in the auditor's inbox. The first day of the audit, I was called into a conference room with 2 auditors and the audit manager. They were polite but direct. "Your spreadsheets are very detailed," one of them said, flipping through a binder. "And we've noticed some differences between your originals and the finalized reports that go to stakeholders. Can you explain those?" I kept my voice steady. "Doug makes those changes. I don't control what happens after I submit my version." The audit manager nodded like that confirmed something he already suspected. "Do you have records of all your submissions?" "Yes. Every one." They asked me to email them everything, which I did before lunch. Less than an hour later, I heard Doug's office door slam. 10 minutes after that, he stormed past my desk without looking at me. For the next 2 days, the atmosphere was tense. People whispered in the hallways. Doug kept disappearing into closed-door meetings. At one point, I saw him walking out of HR with a folder under his arm, jaw tight. Greg swung by on Friday with his coffee and murmured, "I don't know what you did, but he's bleeding." I just sipped my tea and kept working. By Monday morning, the audit team was still in the building, which was unusual. Normally they wrapped up in 2 or 3 days. This time they were asking for more records. Old records. Stuff from before I even worked there. Doug's office door stayed closed all day. When he finally emerged, his face was pale, and he left without saying a word to anyone. That's when I knew it. They'd found something bigger than just my spreadsheets. By midweek, the auditors had basically taken over the second-floor conference room. Laptops open, stacks of files everywhere, the doors shut most of the time. You could tell they were deep into something, not the polite, routine sampling you see in a normal year, but a full-on dig. I didn't hear from Doug at all for 3 days. No emails, no corrections to my work. Then, on Thursday morning, he finally appeared at my desk. "We need to talk," he said. His voice was low, controlled, but I could see the muscle in his jaw twitching. He led me into his office and closed the door. "They're asking for copies of Q2 and Q3 reports from last year," he said. "If they come to you, you send them to me first. Don't just forward them." I met his eyes. "I've already sent them my original files. Weeks ago." The pause he gave me was long enough to feel like a physical weight in the air. "You shouldn't have done that," he finally said. "They asked," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. He leaned forward in his chair. "You think you're clever, don't you?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to, my silence was enough. That afternoon, I got an email from HR. Subject: "Follow up on audit findings, mandatory meeting tomorrow, 10 a.m. The CC list caught my attention. Doug, the COO, the audit manager, and Janice from HR. I had a feeling the follow-up wasn't going to be about me. Friday morning, I walked into the conference room and took a seat at the far end of the table. Doug was already there, flipping through a folder like he wanted to look busy. The COO came in next, then Janice, then the audit manager with a thick stack of papers. It started calmly enough. The auditors walked through their process, how they'd matched receipts to reports. Then the audit manager slid a printed spreadsheet toward the COO. "This is the version submitted by the finance analyst," he said, nodding at me. "And this is the version presented to stakeholders, with significant alterations." He flipped to the next page. Those alterations directly affected the reporting of discretionary spending by over $70,000 across 2 quarters. The room went quiet. The COO turned to Doug. "Do you have an explanation for this?" Doug started talking fast, something about reclassifying expenses, making numbers more digestible, the usual corporate fluff. But the audit manager cut him off. These changes weren't cosmetic. Funds were moved from their actual categories into vague ones with no supporting documentation. That's not simplification. That's misrepresentation. Doug's face went red. "Are you accusing me of—" "We're saying these changes are inconsistent with proper accounting practices," the audit manager said flatly. Janice from HR shifted in her seat, already looking like she was calculating damage control. The COO didn't say much, just told Doug they'd continue the discussion in his office after the meeting. When it ended, Doug didn't look at me once. But as I walked past him, I could feel the heat coming off him, like he was barely holding himself together. By Monday, the whispers were everywhere. People from other floors were talking about something big in finance. I overheard someone from IT say they were pulling Doug's email archives for the auditors. And then on Wednesday afternoon, the news dropped, not officially, but loud enough to spread within an hour. Doug was taking an indefinite leave of absence. No one believed it was voluntary. Doug never came back. The indefinite leave turned into a formal termination about 6 weeks later. The official announcement was buried in an internal memo full of other HR updates, But by then, everyone already knew. The audit findings became part of a larger internal investigation. I wasn't privy to the whole picture, but I heard enough through the grapevine to piece it together. Doug hadn't just been massaging numbers. He'd been shifting money between budgets to make quarterly performance look better on paper, hiding overages, and in at least 2 cases, misreporting vendor payments entirely. When the auditors cross-referenced my originals with his final versions, the pattern was obvious. The COO escalated it to corporate compliance, which meant it left HR's hands entirely. That's when they pulled his emails and call records, and that's when the real trouble started for him. I don't know if law enforcement ever got involved, but I do know the board of directors was briefed, and Doug's LinkedIn quietly went dark a month later. The only trace of his exit was a bitter comment I overheard from someone in accounting. "You can't keep your rocket from crashing if you lie about the fuel." As for me, things shifted fast. The next quarterly review, the COO personally thanked me for my thorough record keeping and told me to keep sending my originals directly to internal audit as a matter of policy. Greg from sales slapped me on the back in the break room and said, "Guess you got the last laugh, Control Center." Even Janice from HR, who'd been all too eager to treat me like the problem in that first meeting, was suddenly friendlier. I wasn't naive enough to think she'd changed her stripes. She was just smart enough to know where the wind was blowing. But the real satisfaction came 2 months later at a local networking event. I spotted Doug across the room, standing alone near the buffet table. He'd put on some weight, his suit didn't quite fit right, and his name tag now read consultant, with no company listed underneath. He caught my eye for a second, just long enough for me to give him the smallest, most polite smile I could manage before turning away. No words, no gloating, just the quiet, permanent reminder that he'd tried to bury me over a joke, and instead, I'd ended his career. And in the end, it all started with keeping it simple.